interesting in comparison to like a lot of other political people that you may look at their background. Before she went into her political government roles, like before she became a diplomat and all that, she was a political scientist, right? Ask me what her research focus was. Ask me. Child, Soviet military strategy. Her research focus was Soviet military strategy. Cold War power dynamics. Y'all know how I love talking about power dynamics. So, I was sitting here like as the kids go. Yes, Cold War power dynamics and what civil military relationships. This is a systems thinker, okay? This is somebody who understands the whole entire board. She's not looking at isolated incidents. She's looking at the whole grand picture. The whole grand picture. This is master level strategist here, right? Because she's going to be able to look at it and understand relationships and power dynamics, understand how everything is moving. But she had a very specific research area, right? That's very specific. It's important to note that she worked in the White House during the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I just want y'all to keep that in mind, because as you saw, there were some other notes that I had, right? You've seen the other slide. It talks about Project 25, right? We're going to talk about some language things, right? Just keep in mind, she was in the White House during the collapse of the Soviet Union. So just keep in mind that level of expertise, that still matters today. I don't care what you say, because you can see the legacy. We're going to dive more into it, but you can see the legacy and the impact of previous approaches and current approaches, right? Because we'll talk about what patterns. Let's get into it. Let's literally get into this, because I think I want to say a little bit more before I talk about us trying to jump into why Condoleezza was called in, right? Because I think I have to sometimes slow it down just a little bit more, because I really want this to be really good and packaged right. So when we chop this up and you look at this lady like, okay, that lady came with them receipts. She came with those receipts. Okay. So what's very interesting, once again, about her background, because we got to jump into the Cold War element, because I feel like, once again, people do not talk about what this lady knows and her expertise, because this is wild, right? She literally wasn't just a politician. She was a Cold War strategist, a Soviet Union specialist before she ever hit a government job. Do you know how clutch that is? You know how amazing that is, that she literally was a Cold War strategist and a Soviet Union specialist before she ever got her first government job. Okay? So, in with regards to that, right? Because she was teaching at Stanford. And there's a nice little story I had pulled from Stanford journals, but I'll come back to that piece. She's literally a political science professor at Stanford who studied the Soviet military doctrines, right? That's a whole nother. She was physically studying their doctrines, right? Strategic decision making inside of the Soviet Union, right? So she understands not just their doctrines as a whole, which is highly important when you're trying to go in a situation like war and combat with somebody. She physically understands the Soviet military's doctrines, right? Because she was a professor, so she's teaching these things. She had strategic decision making inside of the Union, the Soviet Union. So understanding how they were making their decision, their choices, right? Very, very important to what strategy. And then she understood the civil military relations in what authoritarian systems, right? Very significant information, very much so. So this means she was able to analyze the Soviet leaders through this really specialized lens, because she's able to process and understand their thoughts about war and power. Because what we talked about, the power dynamics and how that really plays more than people really think. So I'm gonna just quickly go into what happens like during the time frame, like she was in office with the White House, the first portion, right? So when she was in her role in 1989, this is during the Soviet collapse, of course. So 1989, 91, I'm actually start to look more at my notes so I can give you the exact information. She served as the senior director for Soviet and East Europe affairs. So let me say that again. So she served as the senior director for Soviet and East Europe affairs. So this means she was advising the U.S. government during the fall of the Soviet Union. Major events that happened during that period were the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Eastern Europe revolutions, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 91. So she isn't just like studying history. She was in the policy rooms during one of the biggest, and I mean biggest, geopolitical shifts in modern history, right? So remember how before we were talking about being in proximity to that girl? Like at this point, for the point of this conversation, she is the asset. She is the asset that you want to be in proximity to, because that wealth of knowledge is like, right? Now let's talk about the flex of her being fluent in Russian. Because keep in mind, she was studying their doctrines. So to understand, you want to make sure you will want to know the language so that you're making sure that you're translating things correctly. If you always got to talk to somebody else, you can miss things. Things can get lost in translation. So if you're supposed to be someone that's like a point of contact in between, right? If the president said, hey, this was my person that I learned everything from, right? I get all my information. You will want this person to understand language properly. You want them to be able to understand like general messaging and nuances, because what you don't want them to miss something important, and you don't want them to hype it up. You don't want them to put 20 on 10. That is never good. You need them to be able to properly understand threats and understand when something is actually not a threat. Quick example, right? Just randomly example. I remember being a child during 9/11 when that occurred, and being home based at the time. And I distinctly remember online, they would show us pictures with people with their thumbs up, right? In America, and generally people who speak English, they typically interpret, or I would say native English speakers would interpret when someone puts their thumb up as a positive thing. That means good. Typically that translation means good. That's good. I come to find out sometime later, as we're going to study, what was happening within the war and earlier Miss Science, and I had an instructor who was also like a commander, and actually he got called out of teaching our class while we were in the middle of teaching when I was in high school. We were reviewing a lot of this stuff. He told us something very significant about the importance of understanding language and other people's, communication styles and different things, which is a whole other story.